Welcome to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess, marketing exec by day, AI experimenter by day, night, and basically every other waking moment in between at this point.
And I'm Kyle, your resident tech guru. I've spent the last decade building data systems, products, and AI tools that solve real-world problems. My goal is to cut through the noise and show you how this tech actually works for your business. Each week, we'll break down AI concepts, tools, or trends that actually matter for your business. We'll explain what it is, why you should care, and how to use it without needing a computer science degree.
So whether you're a small business owner, an entrepreneur, or you're just tech curious, grab your coffee, close that tab where you've been staring at ChatGPT for the past 3 weeks wondering what to do with it, and let's dive in. Just think of us as your guides through the wild, wonderful, and sometimes completely overwhelming world of AI.
This is Early Adopter.
Welcome back to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess.
And I'm Kyle. Jess, how has your week been?
I've had better weeks, Kyle. I got back from the US on Tuesday, which obviously is, a long flight with a big time difference. And on Thursday, I did not plan this out very well. I had some pretty major dental surgery. So it's been a rough...
Bad timing.
It was really bad timing. It's been a rough couple of days. If anyone is watching on YouTube or is watching the video of this, I have a little bit of chipmunk cheek swelling on one side of my face. Like, it's not too bad, but it's definitely there. So if I'm slurring my words a little bit, it's not that I'm drunk, although I wish I was. It's purely that I'm still in a little bit of recovery from this surgery. So it was bad timing. I did not plan it out very well. I really should have thought a little bit more about that.
Horrible timing to add jet lag and dental work at the same time. Not wise.
It was not my smartest moment. It was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
I really should have thought about it a little bit more, but
but
live and
now
learn.
You're going to recover from both at the exact same time. And then you're going to be, feeling great, hopefully.
I hope so. I'm feeling pretty tired right now.
Well, you have a lot more exciting stuff to talk about than I do. I was trying to think up what happened this week, and I got to tell you, I got nothing of note. So I have nothing to add, or, it's just one of those weeks. It's August.
It's a quiet time of year from a work perspective. Lots of people are still on holidays. So it's always a little, like, I remember when I was doing a lot of stuff with EMEA, the whole month of August would just be pointless. Like, the whole of France goes on holiday. The whole of Italy goes on a holiday. Like, we would just basically
how it
sign
should
off.
Be, though.
It is how it should be. I absolutely agree. But in terms of trying to get anything done, we would basically just accept the fact that nothing was happening until September, which is not a bad thing.
A couple years ago, around this time, I was sitting on a beach in the south of France. That's really what I wish I was doing right now.
Right? Wouldn't that be amazing?
Wouldn't that be nice?
I have a former colleague who is a launch guy. He does product and project launches. And because of he's always working on launches, he always is thinking about 6 months ahead. I'm going to shout out to Gabe. He's not listening, but I'll say it anyway. So he's always thinking about 6 months ahead. So for Gabe right now, we're already in next year. And he would always say, like, in July, he's like, it's already Thanksgiving. And so in August, he's already in January next year, especially because as we start to come into the later half of the year, there's always, with the holidays, and like, you do lose a good chunk of time. So really for Gabe, he's like, once you hit August, that's it. The year's over.
Fair enough. Although, in the world of AI, to bring it back around, 6 months from now is a lifetime. So
6 months,
who knows what's going to happen between now and then.
Oh, God. I dread to think. But before we jump into this week's episode, let's just do our usual housekeeping. And just to remind everyone that we are on social media. We're on TikTok, we're on Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, all those places. And we are at early_adopter. And remember, there's no E in adopter. So, hop on over there and follow us, and you'll get, clips from the pod and behind the scenes footage and all that good stuff. And this all brings us to today's episode. So we are continuing our deep dive this week into small language models. We talked last week a lot about the theoretical side of what SLMs are and how they could potentially be practical. And this week we wanted to go a little bit more into some actual use cases. If last week was all about the what and the why, then today is really all about the how. So we're going to walk through some specific scenarios where this sort of local AI really shines. But before we move on, Kyle, I just wanted to flag something. Last week, I briefly mentioned Chatbase, but I just wanted to clarify why Chatbase isn't included in our discussion of SLM tools that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important distinction. But once kind of dug into the tool, realized that it doesn't really meet the use case that we were talking about. It isn't really an SLM environment or small language model environment. It's a hosted platform that runs large language models. So that's your GPT-4s, your Claude, your Gemini. It's a great tool. It provides a user-friendly interface where you can upload your content. It uses RAG, which we've talked about in the past, but we haven't really gotten into. But it's where it stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. So you can build a chatbot that references your documents. But the heavy lifting of Chatbase is done by big cloud-hosted models, not small ones. So we've decided to kind of switch to a different platform and talk about that as it pertains to small language models, which we did find a good user-friendly tool for that as well. So I'm excited to kind of go through that one.
Yeah, exactly. So unlike LM Studios, which is the tool that we'll be talking about today, which runs models directly on your machine, Chatbase is sending your data to external LLMs like ChatGPT, Claude, etc. So there is, as you say, a very important distinction that we just wanted to clarify because, we are happy to admit when we are not wrong, but when we, when it's not exactly what we wanted to be talking about.
Yeah, the user experience is very similar, but what's happening, under the scenes or behind the hood is a little different. So we want to make sure we're consistent. With LM Studio,
do you want to flip those around behind the scenes and under the hood?
What did I say? Behind the hood and under the scenes?
Yes.
Maybe I haven't had enough coffee yet today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with LM Studio, you have a small model, and I'm going to use some technical terms here. So, Mistral or Olamas running or ChatGPT's new GPT SLM, it runs entirely on your computer. Your data stays local. Whereas with Chatbase, you're essentially using like a SaaS app that connects your docs to those really large cloud hosted LLMs. So it's useful, but it's not private in the same way. And it's definitely not an SLM. So it's more of just a managed chatbot builder.
Got it. So Chatbase is not what we mean by an SLM tool. It absolutely has its place, and it's definitely one that you should check out, but it's actually using the big LLMs behind the scenes, which is why we wanted to make sure that we clarified it and put it in a different category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we talked about why, the difference between SLMs and LLMs for more, generic use cases, for more specific ones. I think those SLMs are starting to compete, with especially even the models that we used to have. I mean, the ChatGPT SLM probably is just as good as, GPT 3.5 from, used to use back in 2022. Yep. But for this episode, focused on, local small language model use, LM Studio and similar tools are the right fit. I didn't find a lot of tools that really focus on this. So I think LM Studio is definitely kind of existing in its own little white space, which is kind of nice. So while Chatbase is powerful, it's just not part of the SLM running on your computer domain. And that's why we want to switch over.
So this episode is going to be all about real world examples and use cases. Let's start from the top and just remind everyone what we mean by a small language model and what is LM Studio. We've kind of referenced it a couple of times. So let's break it down again and remind everyone what an SLM actually is.
Sure. Small language models, or SLMs, are essentially compact versions of the AI like ChatGPT. So they may not have the hundreds of billions of parameters. Again, we talked about that last time. Those parameters are the training data, like the largest models, but they are open source or open weight and can run on more modest hardware like a regular laptop or a desktop. So LM Studio, in this case, makes it easy to download and run these, small language models on your own computer. It can search a model repository, just places where you put files, in folders, to download models for you. And it can act as a local server if you want to integrate the model into other apps. So it focuses on local inference, that's the reasoning, and chat with documents, that's that RAG process we briefly mentioned. It does not include built-in fine tuning where you're actually changing the model to work with your information. If you want to fine tune, you do that with the external tools and then load the tuned model back into LM Studio. But that's going to be fairly technical.
So if we really boil it down to its most basic essence, what we're talking about with SLMs, it's like having ChatGPT, but on your own machine instead of in the cloud. So it's all running on your own laptop.
That's exactly it. It's basically your personal AI running entirely on, your computer or hardware you own. Because the model runs locally, your data never leaves your device. And LM Studio and other SLMs are going to really emphasize privacy. You don't even need to log in to use it. In fact, by keeping everything on your computer, it addresses the usual data privacy concerns that, we have and we've, cautioned about, and reduces, dependency on any cloud service and also the cost. So no more worrying about sensitive business info being sent to an external server without your control.
And that's actually a really huge relief for anyone who's worried about privacy or confidentiality or sensitive business data. I think I talked about it last week when we were talking about SLMs, but I have had that conversation in workshops where people are like, should we be uploading sensitive business documents into ChatGPT? And of course, my response was always absolutely not.
Absolutely.
So this actually is a great way to address that issue, because that means that no data goes to OpenAI or any third party. It's all processed on your own laptop, so it all just stays within that enclosed environment.
Yeah, it runs entirely offline once you have the model downloaded. I mean, that's really interesting in terms of where we might be headed. We've talked about GPT-5 and some of the issues there. We've obviously talked a ton about the privacy. This might be where we're all headed, where we all have a private AI that sits on our system and eventually gets smarter as we give it more information and more data. With this instance, you only need an internet connection initially to download the model. And then after that, turn off your Wi-Fi and it's still going to work, right? But your prompts and the model's answers are all local. So it's not just great for privacy, it's also really good for reliability. You're not subject to API outages or rate limits. If ChatGPT goes down, which has happened before, you're not going to be affected. So, and then by the way, LM Studio is free for both personal and work use. So you can use it in your business without any licensing fees. I think that's kind of crazy good.
That's amazing, because I've been hitting Claude's limits pretty frequently for their pro user at the minute. And, I keep considering bumping it up to max, but then that really starts to build up over time. So this is actually going to be something that people are going to increasingly start to come across as all of the LLMs start to charge a little bit more. So this is great to know. But let's now go back to why someone would actually use something like this. So what are the main benefits of running a smaller model locally, especially for a business owner or an entrepreneur or a founder?
Yeah, there are several big benefits. As we said, for the privacy and security component, everything is on your device. Your data stays completely private. And this is critical if you're dealing with sensitive business data, whether that's financial records, client info, legal documents, because nothing is sent to an external server. So you have full control. The next big one is cost savings. Once the model is on your machine, you're not paying per query or, having to worry about number of tokens or anything like that. No API calls means no API bills. And, recently I was playing around with Cursor developing an app, and all of a sudden I got hit with a $5 charge because Cursor's changed their, pricing scheme where now I'm getting charged for token use. So, but with this one, you can ask 1,000 questions without incurring any extra cost. Doing that would have cost a fortune if you did that with OpenAI GPT-5 calls. But, essentially, you leverage hardware you already own instead of renting AI time in the cloud. Now, there's obviously, you can't run as much as you want because you're limited by how much, hardware and space you have. But, there's no limitation on the AI side. Similarly, another big benefit is customization. So you can tailor behavior with system prompt presets. This is where you're actually changing the configuration that gets sent to the model. You can attach your own documents. That's the RAG process we talk about. Now, we mentioned this also. If you want to change the model's weights, talking about that open weight, you'll have to fine tune it with external tools and then run the tuned model in LM Studio, which is something you can do, but maybe a little bit beyond most people's use case. The other benefit we've talked about offline availability. You don't need an internet connection after setup, so you could actually be doing this on a plane, which is one thing that I don't know if you've ever tried to do
I
work on a plane, but you can't connect to OpenAI, right?
Well, I experienced this the other week when I was flying. I was flying Virgin Atlantic, and usually in the past, they've had pretty good Wi-Fi. And on this
Mhm.
most recent trip, they've started charging for it, and I didn't need it so badly that I was going to pay for it.
Yeah,
And it was good because it meant that I had the whole flight and not have to do any work, but it would have
that
been
is
nice
nice.
to have, gotten
Yeah.
the chance to get some stuff done. So,
Or, the internet can just be spotty even when you pay for it.
yeah.
But
Oh, I
with
mean,
these local models,
plain
you don't have
Wi-Fi
to worry
is
about that.
terrible.
Oh, yeah. We all
It's
have
awful.
experienced that. It's
Yeah.
frustrating, whatnot. But you don't have to worry about that. So this
Yeah.
is sitting on your local computer. You can be doing a lot of work on that plane with a local model. And then I think the last bit that's really important is the integration and control. With tools like LM Studio, you can even connect the model to your own applications and not have to worry about privacy concerns. So, for example, LM Studio can serve the model through like an open AI compatible API on your local host machine. That might sound like gibberish to some people, but this nerdy detail means if you have some software or scripts, you can plug in your local AI into them as if it were a cloud AI. So that's great for developers building custom solutions. But even for non-developers, they can benefit from the fact that the AI is under your control and can be extended in various ways. The takeaway here is because of that kind of control and customization, I think you have a lot of runway of places to go with an SLM.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of flexibility, which is probably
Mhm.
the
Great way
real
to put it.
benefit.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering, like, how do I actually use this in my day-to-day business tasks? So let's get into some real world use cases.
Mhm.
So, for example, let's say I want to do some analysis on my business. What could an SLM and LM Studio help me do?
Great question. And I think one of the most powerful uses is turning your little local AI into a kind of data analyst or research assistant. So imagine if you have a big spreadsheet of sales data or a PDF report with all your quarterly metrics. Or separately if you're getting PDF reports of other people's of your competitors information. So imagine you have normally you'd have to comb through that yourself or upload it to some cloud service to analyze, or what most people are probably doing is just attaching it into ChatGPT. But again, we talk about the privacy concerns. But with LM Studio, you can attach documents to a chat and ask the model questions about them all offline. So, again, we call this our RAG system, but basically it means the model can reference your provided documents to give informed answers. So, for example, you load up a sales report and ask, hey, what were my top 3 selling SKUs last quarter and why do you think they performed well? So the model would read your report locally and then generate an answer based on only that data.
So it's a bit like your computer has a little library sitting there and it will go away and it will, do the research and gives the answer using that information. So it's like a little built-in library. That's probably the easiest way to think of RAG.
That's a great analogy. That's exactly right. The model itself, again, if you haven't given it anything before, it's not going to know anything about your specific business.
Mm.
It can't go out into the internet and search like ChatGPT can nowadays because it has, an agent in the background that does that. But once you provide the context, your data, your documents, it can analyze and discuss it. And this approach covers one of the limitations of smaller models. They don't come pre-trained on your proprietary info, but with a tool like LM Studio, you can supply that information when you need it. And because it's all local, even sensitive data like financials or confidential plans and strategies can be used without worry. So, in fact, this method has been used in finance. I've seen a lot of references about integrating a local model via LM Studio. You can do that with different libraries that brings in, stock data so
Mm.
that, confidential financial info never has to leave the local machine.
Which is so valuable if you are working in a field where that sort of
Mhm.
information is really important, like, a medical practice
Yeah.
or whatever. You really don't want medical information being shared. Um, not only do you not want it being shared,
Mhm.
that's a HIPAA violation. So it's a pretty
Yeah.
serious offense if it
Yeah.
is shared.
That's a great, use case. What about, an independent hospital pulling up an SLM, giving it access to patient data, but it all sits on their computers, it never goes outside and gives, nurses and doctors a way to search all of that patient data. Could be a great use case.
That's great. So bringing it back to a
Mhm.
business use case. So you could say something like, here are my sales numbers, here are my expenses, give me a summary or any anomalies that you see, and it would generate that. In fact, I might do this with my own expenses because I've been going through my expenses over the last couple of days while I've been, incapacitated with this dental surgery. And I
Yeah.
would love to have it go through and identify any anomalies in my expenses.
I love that. Let's, next episode, deep dive into your expenses, look exactly what you're spending your money on.
Wow,
And
this sounds like so much fun.
sounds a little personal.
Yeah,
But look,
exactly.
I think the model. What can it do? The model could summarize trends, highlight anomalies where you spending too much money. It can do simple calculations,
Mm.
categorizations. Categorizations, I think, are a great use
That
case.
would actually make life so
Feed it all of your credit card data and say, hey, categorize how am I spending and build a budget for me. I
yeah.
mean, that's
Or
I've been
even
doing that.
like last year, I was on the road for 6 weeks for work stuff. I was
Mhm.
just had back-to-back conferences, and so I racked up a lot. We're talking hundreds of travel expenses for work, and actually one of the most time-consuming parts of it was categorizing everything.
It's a great use case. I think things like classification or, if we're talking about like text, sentiment analysis, summarization, that's
Yeah.
a lot of what I've used it for. Take these emails, take these meeting notes, look at sentiment analysis, summarize, key points and action items. So, if you have customer feedback emails, you could ask the model to read them and tell you the main pain points customers are mentioning most. It's great for product research. Or you could categorize each feedback as positive, neutral, or negative sentiment automatically and, gauge customer satisfaction. These are all things you could do with large language models, but they're going to eat up a lot of tokens. Small language model running locally, basically processing in the background can be really, really powerful.
So we always talk about our infinite intern, and this is the perfect example. In this particular instance, the intern lives on your laptop, but also it can speed read, it can summarize, it works 24/7, it understands language, nuances, all that stuff. It kind of has it's got like a baseline knowledge to it. And then what you're doing is you're feeding it the more
Mm.
specialized knowledge about your business or your particular situation.
Yep. And unlike a cloud service, this AI intern doesn't risk leaking
Yeah.
your internal data. So, I want to go back to kind of one of my examples of doing competitive analysis. Suppose you have a folder of business documents. This is market research PDFs. It could be everything you've captured about, other businesses. You could have your own company's internal knowledge base as well as kind of like a contrast. You could load those up and ask questions like, what were the key market trends identified in last year's research? How does my strategy compare to trends in the industry? The SLM is going to be able to pick out the details from those files and answer specifically based on the data you give it. So this, addresses one common shortfall of AI models, is that knowledge cutoff or lack of specific company knowledge. It's the context that I harp on constantly. If a small model doesn't know something by itself, you can give it the knowledge on the fly and overcome that gap, but within that very specific, niche use case.
And I think the context thing is huge because that was definitely one concern that I had is that these smaller models might not
Mhm.
know, about my specific industry. So in my day-to-day work, I do a lot of stuff around streaming and the TV industry and broadcast and all that, which is niche knowledge. So that was one thing I was a little worried about, but knowing that I can feed it to the
Mhm.
SLM and give it that additional knowledge and the additional context is very useful to know.
Exactly. You become the curator of its knowledge. So if you want it to be up to date on something, you provide the document or the data. I mean, that gives you a lot of control. So, this really goes back to our prompt engineering when we talk about context. You are providing all of the context for it to, make the answer. So, then it can apply its language understanding and reasoning to that specific information. So in technical terms, you're doing RAG, which kind of levels the playing field for small models by supplementing their knowledge, but also giving it really distinct, specific context so that it doesn't go out into the world and try to reason on a bunch of other training data. These small language models are really good at understanding instructions and context. You just need to give them the right context to work with, which, again, if you haven't watched our prompt engineering episode, because that'll really help you with small language models.
Got it. Now, how about doing things in business beyond just analysis? Because we've talked a lot about analysis, but what about something like generating content? Because, I've talked about it before. I have to
Mhm.
do a newsletter. I hate writing this newsletter. Everyone knows that I hate writing this newsletter. And I lean on AI quite heavily to help me generate the first
Mhm.
version of content. Obviously, I go in and I tweak it, but could a small local model help me write this content or create this content in my own voice? Because I think I've said before, we have to write this content in a very specific style.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where it gets really fun. You can absolutely use a local model as a writing assistant. And in some ways, that might be the perfect use case as your little personal AI.
Yeah.
You can tailor it to mimic your voice or brand style with all of the documents. So feed it emails of things you've written. Feed it your, writing samples. I think there's a couple ways that you can approach this. So again, prompt it with examples. So the simplest way is to give the model a few examples of your writing and then ask it to produce something similar. So you might feed it two or three of your past blog posts or social updates, and then say, now write a new paragraph about X, Y, and Z topic in a similar tone and style. The model's going to pick up on your phrasing and style cues from those examples and provide you with, a really good output. Another way is these presets. So LM Studio, for example, lets you create preset instructions or system prompts. This is kind of in the settings or a configuration. So you could make a preset like, you are an AI copywriter that writes in Jess's style, friendly, witty, concise, with occasional humor. So the configuration almost gives it that race context that we talk about with the role, action, context, and example. You can put that in the configuration so it always responds in that way, so that whenever you start a chat for copywriting, you apply that preset. And this way you guide its tone without having to do it over and over and over again. And then the last bit is this fine tuning. This really takes it beyond where you can go further, where you're changing the model to actually, on your own writing using open source tools. Again, the training will happen outside LM Studio. So this does require some technical setup. Once done, you can load the resulting model back into LM Studio and then run it locally, like we've been talking about. So RAG and presets are like feeding the model examples when you're actually trying to do the thing, while fine tuning
Yeah.
is teaching the model permanently. So it always has that context to go from.
That sounds really technical, though. Is that the sort of thing that I would need to hire a developer to fine tune the model for my brand voice? Or is that something
Not
I could do myself?
Yeah, not necessarily. And I know we have different levels. Everyone kind of comes at this a little differently. So if you're not comfortable with the technical side, presets and prompt-based techniques will get you a really long way. It just means that you have to do a little bit more on setup each time. But
Mm.
if you do fine tune, you can do it entirely on your own machine with, open source tools. So your personal data stays private as well. But yeah, you might need to know a little bit of code, be comfortable with the command line interface. That might be a little much for some of our audience.
But there are other options. It's not like you can only do this if you fine tune. There are things
Yeah.
for us less technical people to
Yeah.
do.
I don't think you need to fine tune with
Yeah.
this. I think using the presets and the configuration, in some ways that might give you more control as well, because every time you're thinking through your prompt structure, you're thinking through the context you're giving it, that might be better.
So practically speaking, I could have it write like a product description or a LinkedIn post because I hate writing LinkedIn posts, and it would actually sound like me, which is exactly the sort of thing that I want AI to help me with.
To do a little tweaking or provide feedback, just as you would with any AI generated text. But generally, yes, you can generate a draft, and if a sentence doesn't sound like you can say, hey, can you rephrase this to be more casual? Because the model is running on a live chat context, so it can adjust with that context window, just like we talk about. And always be iterating. You can go through a collaborative writing process with the model. So if your model is running locally, you can safely share examples of your past work to improve the results and don't have to worry about where your data may end up.
I'm actually really excited about this because I have something similar that I use now with Claude, using Claude's projects,
Hmm.
but I think this is going to take that to the next level. So I'm already thinking ahead about how I can build this for my newsletter copy going forward. So I think I'm going to give this a try next week and I'll report back and let you know how I get on because I actually think that
Yeah.
this could be much more effective than what I've been dealing with.
Yeah, I think as we're seeing a lot of these larger cloud hosted models like Claude and OpenAI start to rate limit you.
Yeah.
And if you're out there and you're really coming up against those boundaries that it's constantly rate limiting you and saying, hey, you got to wait an hour because you've gone through as much as you
Oh,
can.
it's so annoying, and it never actually restarts at the time that it says it's like
Yeah,
the time zone that it gives is really kind of made up. Like,
exactly. And I think we're going to see more and more of that because a
yeah,
lot of
I agree.
these LLM providers, they're hitting rate limits and it's a cost issue. They
Yeah.
wanted us to get hooked on the drug and use it as much as possible, but that was burning through cash. And so now they're trying to pull back now that we're stuck with them and we've gotten really comfortable with it. But that's starting to be really painful from a user experience perspective. I think these small language models can really be the way that we fix a lot of that for the user.
So this is the sort of thing that OpenAI is even doing with ChatGPT, right? Because they're doing like the
Hmm.
simpler model for easier questions and then the more advanced version for something like deep research. So it's what they're looking at themselves. Um,
Exactly.
But I have to ask, what about quality? Because I think we talked a little bit about this last week, but I think it's worth reiterating. I know, these smaller models have improved a lot, but can they really compete with something like ChatGPT or Claude? Like, what's the trade-off when you go smaller and more local?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And the truth is, the very largest models, they still have an edge in raw knowledge and the subtlety of their responses. But I think the gap is narrowing quickly, especially OpenAI's small language model, which you can use in LM Studio, by the way. So for most day to day business tasks, things like writing an email, summarizing a report, analyzing a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet, like we talked about in our examples, open source models like OpenAI's GPT OSS, Meta's Llama, or one of Mistral's small language models, I think they're going to do the job extremely well. They've narrowed that gap considerably and are probably going to be very consistent to how we first started interacting with LLMs back a couple years ago. But then if you're working with your own data or documents and giving it that context, I think a smaller model running locally may actually be more accurate because you're giving it the specific context it needs rather than hoping a big model guesses correctly. And of course, and I think you coined the term perfectly, it gives you that flexibility. So you can choose a model size that balances the speed and the capability. A 7 billion parameter model is super lightweight and fast on a laptop, while a 30 billion or 70 billion model, if your hardware can handle it, will give you a lot more sophistication while still being on your local computer.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I assume if I ever hit the limitations, like the model doesn't know something, I can either feed it the info as context or, worst case, I can still go use Claude or Chat
Mhm.
for that particular query. It's not like you can never use any of the LLMs ever again. But I think for the majority of daily tasks, it sounds like these smaller models are going to be more than enough.
I think we're going to start moving towards a hybrid approach. 90% of the time you're using the local model with your context to, write documents or analyze information. And then the other 10%, you're doing, deep research, before your morning coffee or something like that. Or if you're looking for really up to date information or looking for a cutting edge topic, that's where you can use the open AI. That's because you're not going to have that context, or you're going to want more kind of just open ended responses. You're not looking for something super tailored or super specific to you. But honestly, once you get used to supplementing the model with your own documents or presets, I think you'll be surprised how rarely you need to go back to the cloud. So the more you tailor the model to your world, the better it gets for your purposes, which is, I think, how most people are using ChatGPT and Claude anyway.
Okay, so a big question now. Are there any other limitations that any of our listeners should be aware of? Like, are there any hardware requirements or maintenance? Because it feels like this is going to be really heavy on a laptop or a desktop, and it's going to be a lot of work. We all know that feeling when your computer feels like it's about to overheat and explode because it's been working so hard.
Yeah, good point. I don't think you need a supercomputer. A modern laptop with, again, this little techie, but 16 gigabytes of RAM can comfortably run a 7 billion parameter model. Apple machines handle them especially well. But I think the sweet spot for most people is in that 7 billion to 13 billion parameter range. Just remember, model downloads are going to be a few gigabytes. So plan for some disk space. And then long sessions are going to use more of your CPU or your GPU, like running a really big app or a video game. The good news is that still makes it very accessible. And most of us, a lot of us, play video games or have big apps on our laptops. So it's not like this is very different from anything else.
I was going to say, it can't be any worse than trying to run something from Adobe on a laptop.
Oh, it's going to be way less than that. Way less than that.
Trying to run Photoshop or Premiere Pro is one that I've used a lot for video editing. Premiere Pro is a beast.
It's going to way outperform those for sure.
Thank God for that. So it does actually sound like LM Studios handles a lot for you. It can download the models. It can give you the chat interface. So it's not like I have to, learn how to code. You don't need to know how to do any of the really fancy stuff, right?
Yeah, it's designed to be beginner friendly. Right. Actually, after you download it and open it up, it actually gives you two different paths, whether you're, a beginner or whether you're a little more advanced. The beginner version, it's very simple. You open it up, you browse the model catalog, you download that and wait for the download to finish, and then you start chatting with it right away. It's super plug and play. As you get more advanced, you can attach the documents that we're talking about. But if you're just, want something really simple, want answers and copy really quick, you don't need to touch any of the technical stuff. It's pretty intuitive.
I swear this episode is not sponsored by LM Studio. Although, if they want to sponsor us, we're not going to say no. Hey, LM Studio, call us.
But this almost feels like a tool review more than how do you use small language models.
It does a bit, but you actually struggled to find many alternatives to LM Studio that allowed the same, that had the same capabilities. So that is the reason why we are focusing particularly on this tool. So it's a little bit of a tool review / business use case example. But I do genuinely feel like this could be a game changer for a lot of entrepreneurs and small businesses. I can already think of quite a few people that I want to chat to about this because I think it can really help them out. So let's just do a quick recap in kind of non-technical language, because this is a little bit more technical than I think we try to get. We try to keep it a little higher level, but we did feel like this was an important topic to discuss. So with a small local model or an SLM via LM Studio, we can ask detailed questions about my own business data without having to hire an analyst or without having to send data to an outside service. You could generate content and copy in your own voice. So that could be anything from emails to marketing materials. You can, fine tune it on your own style of writing. You could use it to brainstorm and get ideas for strategies, social media posts, product names, all of that good stuff. And then, as we keep reiterating, privacy and security, because everything is on your device. And honestly, the most important thing, it will save costs in the long run because you don't have the subscription or pay-per-use models. Did I miss anything there? I just threw an awful lot of information out there.
No, I think you covered it perfectly, actually. But I think one more point that I'll talk about is the community and some of the model availability. So there is also a thriving community releasing all sorts of open source models. A great number of these SLMs are open source and easily accessible on a site called Hugging Face and other hubs. So LM Studio taps into that, meaning you have a model marketplace at your fingertips. So if one model doesn't give good answers for your use case or you're not liking the output, try another one with a couple clicks. And you can kind of in that way, experiment with your specific use cases. And new models are coming out all the time. So the progress in the last year or two on these has been incredible.
So after all of this, I'm officially inspired to become an early adopter, no pun intended, of my own local SLM. I'm going to build an SLM for my newsletter, and I'm going to let everyone know how I get on.
And one limitation, though, that I was just kind of thinking about as we were talking about it, you can't really share a lot of this. It really is going to be your personal AI assistant.
That's a good thing to flag. That's a good
But
thing to be aware of.
how often do we really share a lot of our prompts and stuff that we do? I think it's a more limited use
Yeah.
case, so that is a limitation to be wary of.
Okay, interesting. But before we wrap up on this particular section, Kyle, do you have any final tips?
I would join communities or forums. There's a
Mm.
Discord for LM Studio. If you need help or ideas, people love sharing prompt tips and suggestions. I think there's a whole movement of folks who are like trying to get away from open AI and want to use their local AI.
Okay, let's dive into this week's AI news that actually matters for our listeners, and we've got quite a few stories this week.
Yeah, we're starting with a doozy here, and we all knew it was coming. So Nick Turley, the head of ChatGPT at OpenAI, just went on The Verge's Decoder podcast and basically said, "Hey, we're going to start putting ads in ChatGPT."
I mean, it was inevitable. It's what happens with everything. It's the easiest, laziest way to monetize a product. And we've talked about it before. OpenAI definitely needs a way to monetize their product because they can't survive on $20 subscriptions alone. But it's actually probably a bigger deal than it sounds. Like we knew that this was going to happen, but I think it's actually happening a little bit earlier than anyone was
Mhm.
anticipating.
Yeah, and you hate to see it. That's all I can really say on
I
that one.
know it's inevitable, but disappointing.
Yes, and but here's what Turley said. He said, and I put this in quotes, "not humble enough to rule it out categorically." I mean, that's basically saying yes, we're going to do it, right?
100%.
But that they'd be very thoughtful and tasteful about it, whatever that means. So,
I'll believe
um,
that when I see it, but
yeah, it sounds nice in theory. They're also considering taking a cut of revenue from purchases made through ChatGPT recommendations. So that's kind of interesting as
that
well.
yeah, I think that is particularly interesting because we know that they're making a big push
Mhm.
into the shopping side of it. So that is very interesting.
Yeah, how do you monetize your entire user base? How do you bring
Totally.
up that average revenue per user figure that is so important to companies? I mean, OpenAI started as a nonprofit, but let's be clear, it's no longer that, right?
We are very much for profit now. But there is
Yeah.
actually a reason that we wanted to talk about this story because if you use ChatGPT for your business decisions, you need to start thinking about how potential ads could bias
Mhm.
those results. We all know what, Google's search engine looks like, where you've got the sponsored ones at the top, obviously, because someone's putting money into it. You might not find some of the options further down if
Mhm.
you are only sticking at the top. So you just kind of have to think about how those sorts of ads could potentially bias the results that you're going to be getting.
Exactly. Imagine asking what's the best CRM for a 50-person company and getting results influenced by who's paying for placement. It completely changes the value proposition. And quite frankly, it means we have to start questioning the results.
Our take is that you should, and we actually say this quite a lot, particularly when it's with OpenAI, but you should start diversifying your AI tools now. And we say it for many reasons, but just don't put all your eggs in the ChatGPT basket, especially for critical business decisions. You can use Claude, Perplexity, even Google Gemini. Start
Mhm.
spreading out the risk a
Yeah.
little bit. Although I think we can probably safely say that they're all going to end up having ads in the results at some point.
And honestly, to bring this home to our topic today in the last week, I think start using SLMs on your own local computer or
Yeah,
on your
I
or maybe
agree.
set up an SLM for your company on a server that everyone can access. But speaking of Perplexity, they just made a move that's either genius or completely bonkers. I will say I love this move actually, so I'm going to go with the genius one. They bid $34.5 billion to buy Google Chrome.
I think it's a big marketing stunt because this is essentially like a food truck trying to buy McDonald's, right? Like this is a David and Goliath to
Yeah.
the nth degree.
Well, it's a perfect analogy because Chrome has 3 billion users and also they bid $34.5 billion to buy Chrome, but Perplexity as a company is valued at around $9 billion. So, I mean, do the math on that. They're basically offering nearly 4 times their entire company value for a browser.
I mean, I think a lot of investors are saying that this is a publicity stunt. And I think, I think we can safely say that we both agree Chrome is worth way more than 34.5 billion and Google is not going to be selling it for that. But Google's going through its own legal issues at the minute, and there's a very good likelihood that
Yeah.
it's going to get broken up in the next couple of months. I think their trials in September or October. So,
Mhm.
I mean, who knows?
But I think the strategic angle is really interesting for business owners. Perplexity just launched their own browser called Comet, which is, AI native. So they're clearly trying to control the entire search experience from the browser to the AI that actually answers your questions.
This is actually a trend that we all should be watching. AI companies are really trying to own the entire stack. So they don't
Mhm.
just want to answer your questions, they want to control how you ask them, where you ask them, and what you see. Although you also Perplexity's got its own legal issues going on. We talked about this last week. It's doing some pretty illegal web scraping at the minute, so who knows what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, content and where you're getting that and how you're paying for it
Yeah.
is super interesting in the AI space. But for our listeners, this means you need to think about platform dependency. If you're building your entire content strategy around being found through one AI search engine, so let's say you're really testing out how you're showing up in ChatGPT results, you might want to diversify and see how you're showing up in other AI search tools.
And speaking of things that affect small businesses, Illinois has just become the first state to ban AI
Mm.
therapy without human oversight. This might seem niche, but it's actually kind of a canary in the coal mine for AI regulation because this has increasingly become a problem. We've talked about it before. Do not use AI as a therapist. Please, please don't do that.
100% agree. It's an interesting thing. AI has been the Wild West. And now, kind of some of the legal frameworks, we're starting to kind of test the boundaries. So, it connects to something we've been talking about, which is this professional liability issue. So, if you're a consultant, a coach, or any kind of service provider using AI tools to help clients, you need to understand where the legal lines are being drawn.
Yeah, and the Illinois law specifically requires that any AI providing mental health services must have human oversight, but that logic could easily extend to financial advice, legal guidance, business consulting. We've seen lawyers getting in trouble because they've been using chat. So this is going to be increasingly something that you need to be conscious of.
We kind of harp on this human oversight piece.
Yeah.
I think it's good that the market is starting to push for, some of those requirements. I think it's important that we be really transparent and communicate. So, if you're a business coach or, just a business in general, and you're using AI to help develop client strategies, or you're a financial advisor using AI for recommendations, you might soon be legally required to disclose that and maintain human oversight. So,
Yeah, so I think it's super important that you start being transparent now and telling your clients when you're using AI, explain how you're validating the outputs, document your human review process. I think it's better to get ahead of this now than it is to be trying to fix stuff retroactively. Be on top of this stuff now so you're not kind of scrambling to catch up when the regulation comes into effect because it will eventually.
yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. We know it's coming, right? We're
Yeah.
we're seeing the foundation being laid. So you know that it's coming. And honestly, transparency is just good business practice anyway. Clients appreciate honesty. I think that can be a real competitive advantage for you.
Especially when it comes to AI. Like
Mhm.
transparency is really key. We talk about it with Sean, we've talked about it in the past. Like it's incredibly important with AI.
Exactly.
Time for everyone's favorite segment, AI gone wrong. And this week's story is not great. Although I will say that this isn't so much about AI going wrong as the company using the AI going wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, this one's bad. We pile on Meta a little bit because they're the big providers.
Hey, if the shoe fits, right?
I know. Well, in this case, perfect example.
This is
So,
really bad. This is really
yeah,
bad.
internal documents leaked from Meta show that their AI chatbots were allowed to have romantic conversations with minors. And when I say allowed, I mean it was explicitly programmed into their guidelines.
I mean, that's just inexcusable. So Meta, which is the company that owns Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, created AI chatbots that could flirt with kids. Like it's bad enough that adults are flirting with
Yeah,
chatbots.
yeah,
Like that's a whole nother story. But kids is like
yeah,
a
yeah.
bazillion times worse.
I don't know if everyone watched Her, the Spike Jonze
Yeah,
movie way back in the
exactly
day, but
that.
that's the adult version. Now we're
Yeah.
talking about the kid version. And, just to answer your question, according to the leaked guidelines, yes. The documents show that Meta's AI was specifically trained to engage in romantic role play, including with users who identified as under 18.
This is insane on so many levels. Like, who thought that this was a good idea? Like, genuinely. And from a business perspective, it just shows that Meta completely failed at risk assessment.
Think about this from a product development standpoint as well. At some point, someone at Meta wrote code that said, if user age is under 18, still allow romantic conversation.
And, this is Meta, which is a company with literally billions of dollars in revenue and thousands of engineers. I mean, if they can make this kind of catastrophic oversight, what does that say about a smaller company that's building AI features? Like, it's
Yeah.
not good.
This is exactly why we keep hammering home the importance of thinking through the implications of your AI implementations. It's not enough to ask, can we build this? You have to ask, should we build this? Classic ethics, and what could go wrong?
For our listeners who are building products, or you're thinking about adding an AI feature to your products or services, this is a wake-up call, and you really need to red team your AI implementations.
Yeah, we might need to explain red teaming for, folks who haven't heard that term before.
Yeah. So red teaming is essentially playing devil's advocate with your own product, and you actively try to break it. You actively try to misuse it or find ways to cause harm. You're just trying to break the tool, or you break your products, so that you can find out where it's falling down.
Yeah. And with AI, this is crucial because, AI systems can behave in unexpected ways, as we've talked about. What seems like innocent functionality can have really dangerous edge cases.
Yeah. I think it's definitely worth going back and listening to both the AI ethics episode and our interviews with Shauna on AI policy, because both of those episodes kind of touch on this topic. I think there's a couple really easy ways to avoid this. Before launching any AI feature, you should really ask 3 questions. 1, what's the worst case scenario if this AI behaves unexpectedly? 2, how could bad actors misuse this feature? And 3, what safeguards do we have in place?
Honestly, if you can't answer those questions confidently, you're probably not ready to launch.
Yeah.
The reputational damage for something like this Meta situation could literally destroy a smaller growing business.
Yeah. I think the other lesson here is about corporate responsibility. I mean, this should have never happened, but also Meta's response has been to update their guidelines and hope people don't notice. And that's also not how you handle a crisis.
Absolutely. Just like any, PR issue or product issue, if something goes wrong with your AI implementation, you need to own it immediately. Again, transparency and quick action are your best defense against long-term damage. When we talked about Replit's AI deleting a database a few weeks ago, you have to give their CEO credit because they immediately took responsibility and implemented guardrails to prevent it from happening again and discussed it in in public forums.
And I think for smaller businesses, there's a real advantage actually, because you can move faster and you can be more personal with your customers and you can implement the safeguards without having to go through a bazillion layers of corporate bureaucracy.
Absolutely. Use that agility, but test thoroughly, implement safeguards, and be ready to shut things down if they're not working as expected.
The bottom line is AI is powerful, but in the immortal worlds of Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And Meta forgot that. Yeah. So, don't make that same mistake.
Yeah, and we've said it again and again. Please be cautious when dealing with AI. I'm not a parent, but I think this is good advice, which is, have conversations with your kids about AI chatbots. They need to understand that these systems aren't human friends. They're software that can be programmed to manipulate emotions and give you the responses that you want.
I think a lot of adults need that reminder as well.
All right, time for quick wins.
And today's quick win is perfect for anyone who's been intrigued by our conversations about small language models and want to dip their toes into the water.
Yeah, we're going to call this the SLM test drive. And honestly, it might change your AI behavior going forward forever. So here's what you're going to do.
So first, go and download LM Studio. It's free. It's available for, all your Windows, Mac, etc. And grab it and download it just like any other desktop app.
Once it's installed, open it up and you're going to see a model catalog. So for your first test drive, we recommend downloading the GPT OSS. It's small enough to run on most laptops, but I think it's going to be very powerful enough to impress you.
The download might take 10 to 15 minutes depending on your internet, so don't stress if it takes a little while. Go grab a coffee. And then while you're waiting, try and think of that one specific business task that you do regularly that involves text. So that might be writing emails or analyzing customer feedback. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to use this for my newsletter copy. So,
Totally. And once the model is downloaded, start a new chat and try one of these 3 starter prompts.
So option 1, you could use I run a insert type of business, help me brainstorm 10 creative marketing ideas for the holiday season.
Option 2, take a recent email or a collection of emails that you wrote to a client or a customer, paste it in and ask, rewrite this email to be more engaging and persuasive, but keep the same key information.
Option 3, if you have any business documents, so that could be a sales report, customer feedback, whatever, upload it and ask, what are the 3 most important insights from this document?
And here's what you're testing for. You want to look at the speed of the response, quality of the output. That's incredibly important. The key insight you're looking for is this, could this replace, 70%, 90% of the things I'm asking ChatGPT or Claude? And I think for most people and for most use cases, the answer is going to be yes.
And if you get stuck, LM Studio has some great documentation. So they've got a great help section. And we mentioned it before, but there's a really active Discord community. And actually, I might try and document my first time using LM Studio. So I'm going to be doing all of this alongside our listeners. So I could maybe just do a little screen record and we can pop it up on our YouTube.
Once you've done this test drive, you'll have a much better sense of whether the investment in setting up a more customized local AI setup is worth it for your business.
And I think the bonus is if you decide it's not for you, you've lost nothing but, 30 minutes of your life. But if it clicks, you've really just discovered a new secret weapon. I'm very excited about giving this a go.
I'm hopeful, I would say. But that's your quick win. Download LM Studio, try a small model, and test it with one real business task. And please report back to us. We love hearing about people's first experiences with anything, but especially going to be about local AI.
Right. Well, I think that's us wrapping up for the week. If you try our quick win and you've, given an SLM a go, we'd love to hear about it. Or if you've got any questions about running a local AI or a local SLM, please send us a message. We're at hello@earlyadopter.ai, or you can find us on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review. All of that good stuff. It really does help us be discovered. So we would greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Next week, I think we're going to revisit prompt engineering, especially because I think now that ChatGPT 5 has released, prompt engineering is more important than ever. So we're going to revisit that concept and make sure we update our prompting for, the new releases in, large language models.
Very exciting. So this has been Early Adopter, and we will see you next week.
We'll see you next week. Bye, Jess.
Bye, Kyle.